Hey guys, how's it going? So, I thought I'd make this video to talk about the basics of RTA before you even play a lot of the concepts when you're just entering and you just don't really understand all of the things. I wanted to talk about playstyles, how you should approach it, types of characters you should have built, understanding prebans, speed, first pick versus second pick. I talk about that a lot, how to deal with debuffs and cleansers, and counterpicks and planning ahead. I thought these would be all very important things, and I want to kind of just go over all of it. Now, it'll start with the really basic things, and then go into stuff that's a little more technical or a little more complex. But anyways, let's just get right into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is what are the different playstyles. So the main ones are standard, aggro, and cleave. And I'll talk about them in a second, but there's also some subdivisions. There's tank down, I suppose, and control, although they're not really seen as much. So we'll mainly talk about standard, aggro, and cleave. Now, standard is what most people play. It doesn't really require crazy gear. It's more drafting, understanding, and also just unit pool. So a standard team might be something along the lines of you have a team of like Arrowell, Apocalypse Ravi, Mediator Kowarik, Sharoon, and Spectre Tenebria. This is just a random example, but essentially you have a tank, you have a DPS, you have a couple of supports, and you have another DPS. Now, you could actually do something like swap the Sharoon and then have another DPS, and you could only have one support. Some people do that, but this is kind of a general standard team. This is kind of how a lot of people play the game, is they just like a standard team of 2 to 3 supports, 2 to 3 DPS, and you can go fast as well. They could have something instead of Mediator Quirk, they could have Conquer Lilies, but in general, you're not insanely aggressive. You can be flexible and you can be a little more aggressive or more defensive, but this is standard play generally. Now, let's talk about what aggro is. So aggro might be something along the lines of you have Emo Lilius, you have Spectre Tenebria, Aiden, Mediator Kowarik, and then let's say Briarwitch Asaria right here. Now, this is a team that's a lot more aggressive. You're trying to kind of run the opponent down, but you still have some defensive ability. Essentially, you get rid of some of your defensive strength to go a lot more offensive. You try to cripple the opponent's team at the very beginning of the fight, and then kind of roll with it for the rest, where your units don't just instantly die, you don't completely roll over, but you're usually getting the first turn. So you're taking your turns before the opponent, you're usually debuffing them, or just trying to take something out very quickly. Aggro is very popular as well. I would say standard and aggro are the two main playstyles you'll see the most, and it's usually a type of playstyle where you can be flexible and you can go into aggro or into standard depending on how you draft your team after the first couple of picks. Now, the next one is cleave. Cleave, I would say, is the least played of the three, but it's still very important to note, and you'll have to build a lot of characters to fight against it. But a cleave team might consist of something such as Zio, Jacko, Strays, Lua, and let's say Bran. Let's get rid of the Lua, and then let's put in something like let's say Briarwitch Asaria instead. So the cleave team, generally what it is it's trying to take out your entire team before you get a chance to respond at all. So sometimes wipe out your whole team in one go before you get a chance to even fight back once or use a single skill or take a single turn. That's one type of cleave. Another type of cleave might be just taking like half of your team out instantly, and then you might only have a support and a tank and you're not really able to fight back against the rest of the team. But usually a cleave team will crumple almost immediately if the opponent gets an actual strong attack in. Like let's say if Aiden takes a turn, then the match might be completely over immediately, or a Senya, something along those lines. But cleave is seen a little bit less and it requires much higher gear. I would say standard requires the least amount of gear. Then aggro requires more than that, and then cleave requires usually the most because you need to have very fast speed gear to truly make it work, although it is easier nowadays with characters like Zio, for instance. But in general, those are the three main playstyles. Now, tank down is kind of like standard, except even bulkier. You don't see it that much often, and you might only see it when used against cleave, in fact. And the other team, control, is pretty much just overwhelming the opponent with debuffs so that they can't really respond, but that's not really seen that much overall, and that could be a derivation of either standard or cleave, so it's not really its own thing too much at the moment. So, let me just put these characters away real quick. And let's talk about what to build. What do you want to build when you're getting into RTA? So I would say you would want to build, you know, at least a few DPS and at least a few supports. I made a video before about what characters I recommend newer people entering RTA build. So, you know, there's a bunch of free characters such as Spectre Tenebria and Aiden, etc. And characters you're pretty much guaranteed to get or that you could choose from some of the free selectors that we get in RTA. But I would say in general, when you're just trying to begin and maybe hit master or something like that, or go a little bit above, I've heard stories of people being able to get to up to champion with just 6 characters built, but I wouldn't recommend that. I would say building something along the lines of 2 tanks, so maybe someone like Arrowell and Yolha, just as an example. I would say at least 5 DPS, maybe. So you could have like Aiden, Spectre Tenebria, and then like a few others. And then I would say maybe 4 supports or so, 4 to 5 supports, and they can be different variations. So you could have a support such as Mediator Koeric. He's a cleanser, but then you could also have a support such as Conqueror Lilius or Angel of Light, which are debuffers, and Conqueror Lilius is also a speed character. So these are different types of supports, and you could argue, I suppose Arrowell is also a support, but she's a tank, but I'm counting that as something separate. But so you want a couple of tanks, you want a few supports at least, I would say maybe more along the lines of 4 to 5, and then you want some DPS such as, like, let's say a few of these, right? So this is just an example of some of the things that I would recommend you have built before you enter RTA, and I would try and focus all of your gear on a specific subset of units that you not only understand, but are just kind of your best characters. Because if you try and spread all your gear all around when you're newer, you're just going to have a bunch of very poorly built units, and it's not really going to work at all, so I don't recommend that. So overall, just try and gear a smaller subsection, and once you have those geared, then you can start to expand to building other things and get a little bit more ambitious. But until then, just make a smaller overall team. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, and I've talked about this a million times, and I'll talk about a million times in the future as well, is just the first pick versus second pick. I guess you could call it dilemma, but mainly core feature. Whenever you start a match, there's a 50% chance your first pick or second pick. And what's important about that is when your first pick, you get to kind of determine the pace of the match. So just as a very quick example, let's say you pick Navy Captain Landy, the opponent now has to pick 2 characters. Let's just pretend they pick these 2 characters. Then you pick 2 characters. Let's say you pick these 2. Then the opponent has to pick 2 more. So let's say they pick those 2. But what's really important is they have 4 picks and you have 3 picks, and now you get to pick 2 and they only get to pick 1. And so what's really important is essentially you're drafting your entire team around these 4 picks, and they're drafting their whole team around these 3 picks. So you have an advantage where you get to surprise them with 2 characters that can completely counter their team. So let's say you decide you end your draft with, I don't know, this and this. And so the opponent's like, oh crap, I have to ban one of these 2, but I can't ban both, and both of them are good against my team. And then they pick one character, let's say this, and let's pretend that you can't really fight it, so you're going to ban this. So you ban, let's say, this character, and they can only ban one of them, so they go, oh crap, well, I guess I'm going to ban this one. But then you have the advantage in that you had one extra character that they weren't able to react to in their draft. So that's something very important. So when your first pick, usually kind of the aggressor, and the second pick player is usually a little more defensive and they have to play a little bit safer, be more coherent with their draft, be very safe, make it so that when they pick a character like, let's say, Aiden or something, that they also pick a character that can help protect Aiden so the opponent isn't able to just completely abuse them with their final picks. So that's something very important with first pick versus second pick. I go into depth a lot more in some other videos, but just a very basic concept that's really important to understand, that when you're first pick, you kind of get to be the aggressor. You get to set the pace of the match. The character that you first pick, they have to be responding to you. So try and make sure that's something really important. And also, especially when you're newer, make sure you pick a character that is contested, that you don't want to fight, and also a character that you might have well geared, one of your stronger units. So maybe you have Emma Lilius geared and you don't really want to fight her, but then also she's one of your best characters. So make sure that you first pick a character like that, because they're highly contested among all the players. So that's very important. Next, I want to talk about pre-bans. This is actually similar and goes along with it, but I recommend that you pre-ban characters that maybe you don't have or that you really can't deal with. That seems kind of obvious, but also when you're first pick, you might not want to ban a character like Lilius because you really want to pick them, so your opponent has to use their ban on that, so you could instead use your ban on something else. But when your opponent is first pick and your second pick, you might have to ban something like Lilius. Even though you want to use it, you just can't afford to let your opponent have it unless you actually have a counter to that. So keep that in mind. It's very important. You might be swapping your pre-bans every single time your first pick or second pick, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. You'll find out as you play like what you really can't deal with or what you really don't want to fight, but it's definitely important. The next concept is something I would call speed privilege. I'm kind of just coming up with that right now, but essentially what speed privilege is let's say the opponent picks something like Conquer Lilius. They now have the first turn advantage. Their character is pretty much the fastest, and you could do one of two things. You could either try and contest their speed and outspeed them, or you could kind of just go more bulky and safe. So let's say you picked Apocalypse Ravi and Mediator Quirk, you're kind of conceding the first turn to them, at least for now. Later on the draft, let's say you decide to pick something like Payra to try and contest. That can totally work, but what I'm saying is they have speed privilege until you try to do that. And what is speed privilege? So essentially, when you have speed privilege, so you have the first turn guaranteed, well, now the opponent has a lot of units that they can't really pick because they can be countered. So let's say you pick Aiden or something. Well, now the opponent is able to pick something like, let's say, Last Piece Karin, and I know he's around here somewhere, and Zahak. Well, both of those characters are able to immediately take out Aiden, so it becomes a riskier pick because they have the privilege of the first turn. They're able to pick these characters that aren't as fast as most openers, but they're faster than the rest of your team, and they can hard counter certain characters that you have. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, let's say they picked like this. It's a terrible draft, but let's just pretend someone did that, and then you responded with Zeo and Rand. Well, now you essentially have the speed privilege, where the opponent's units that they picked that are slower are now much weaker because they didn't pick safe, bulky characters like, let's say, Apocalypse Ravi or something. They are now being punished for that because you are getting the first turn, and they've lost the privilege of having that first turn. Another example, a very popular one actually, is let's say you have a full draft, essentially, and then you picked 0 fast characters whatsoever, and then the opponent at the end pick something like Stray's Leica. This is a very popular draft. So since you didn't contest the speed whatsoever, they now have these characters that instantly kill a member of your team, and since they're faster than you, there's not really anything you can do to respond to it unless you picked a specific counter ahead of time, but they normally are picked at the end, so it's unlikely that you did that. So what's important there is you have to plan ahead and think, okay, well, they could pick that, and I'm not really sure what I can do, so I need to ahead of time pick a character that's not only supports my team, but also prevents them from doing that. So picking a character such as Payra earlier in the draft, not at the very end, but thinking ahead of time, can help counter that. And that also goes into my next topic that I want to go over, which is planning ahead and counter picks. So speed privilege is definitely something that factors into that as well, because you have to realize that if the opponent's the first turn, you have to plan a little bit differently. Now, pretty much every single character in Epic 7 has a counter pick, or, well, hopefully multiple. The more broken they are, usually the less counter picks that they have, but that's besides the point. You have to protect your units especially too, and this also goes along with the topic earlier of first pick versus second pick. So you have to pick characters that protect each other and that are safe. There's a lot of characters that are strong characters, but they're not safe, and you can't pick them early in the draft. So, for instance, let me move some of these characters. Oh, whoops. Let me remove some of these characters back. So, if the opponent has something like Conquer Lilius, you can't really pick Remnant Violet into that, because that's not a safe character at all. Not only does she counter it, but there's plenty of other characters that hard counter him, and he's hard to protect if you pick him that early. Now, on the other side, the Conquer Lilius picker could pick Remnant Violet near the end of their draft very easily, because since they have the first turn, and because Conquer Lilius actually counters a lot of the characters that fight Remnant Violet very easily, so essentially you're almost planning ahead automatically by picking a character like this, by giving yourself a lot more leeway in what you can pick later on in the draft, such as Remnant Violet as a random example. But it's very important to plan ahead, so if they have someone like this, you could pick a character such as Zeo to contest that, and then also Apocalypse Ravi, because then you feel very safe. You have a character that doesn't have a crazy amount of counters and is relatively flexible and works in a lot of situations, and then you have a character that directly contests the character that they picked. So there's many ways to approach that, but you have to pick characters that you feel more comfortable, more safe with. And especially when you're starting out in RTA, you're going to have some of these comfort picks. Maybe you have an Emo Liz you feel safe with, or Emo Queric, or maybe your Spectre Tenebria you feel like you always need. So you have to find these characters that are relatively safe in your draft and find out how to protect them. And it might take a little bit of time, and it depends on your unit pool as well, but you're going to have to adapt that based off of what you're fighting and based off of what is popular. But it's really important that you don't just pick willy-nilly, that you actually pick characters that can synergize well together and actually protect each other to make a coherent team comp. You can't just pick 5 strong characters, well, unless they somehow work together, but you can't just pick 5 random characters. You need to pick characters that actually can help prevent each other from dying. So let's say Apocalypse Ravi is really weak to debuffs, and there's no way that you can deal with that. Well, you pick Mediator Queric to help with the cleansing, and then you pick Apocalypse Ravi to just be a safe DPS to guarantee you at least have a DPS on board, and now you have cleanse too, so you feel safer. And this perfectly goes into the next subject, which I would say is debuffs versus cleansers at the moment. I would say overall in the game, but at the moment it's even more so important. So debuffs are insanely powerful in the current state of the game, and they're very, very dangerous. So when the opponent picks something like Conqueror Lilius, almost always a player will pick at least one cleanser or something that directly contests it. So they could pick someone like Mediator Queric, they could pick Ocean Breeze Lolica, they could pick both of them together, but what's important is they actually have a cleanser, something that can directly contest it. Because otherwise, let's say you don't pick either of them, you don't pick anything to help deal with this, and you just decide to pick Apocalypse Ravi and, let's say, Aiden, just as a random example. Well, they already have so many powerful debuffs, and you have nothing to deal with that, so you're now forced later in the draft to show off cleansers. Otherwise, you're just going to get completely run over. They're just going to do whatever they want. And you also aren't picking characters that are safe enough. You want to show as little of your hand as possible to the opponent. You want to pick characters that are relatively neutral and can be flexible and used in a lot of different situations. If you hard commit to certain characters, well, you're going to be in a lot more trouble. So what a lot of people will do is directly as soon as someone picks a character like this, you need to pick at least one cleanser or something like Zeo, let's say, that actually outspeeds and stops them. You need to pick something directly against them. And so debuffs are so powerful at the moment that characters like Mediator Queric are almost must picks all the time against these powerful characters. But one cleanser often is enough, because once you get to the very end of the pick and ban phase, the opponent could just ban your one cleanser, and then, well, what are you going to do? You're going to get debuffed to hell, right? And then you're in a lot of trouble. So normally people will pick like one cleanser plus one other character to either cleanse or deal with Conqueror Lilius. Now you could pick something such as the Summer Lolica that I showed off earlier, or the Zeo that I also showed off earlier. You could pick like Destina and Queric, not at the same time, but like possibly later on, depending on how the draft evolves. What's really important is to understand that even though generally you'll be banning the final unit of your opponent's side and they'll be banning the final unit of your side, often you will have to prepare perfectly for their team beforehand. You need multiple counters to their characters, and you have to be very safe in how you pick them. So you pick Mediator Queric plus another safe character, 2 safe people. Then let's say your opponent responds. I can show you an actual draft. If someone picks Conqueror Lilius, and then you pick Navy Captain Landy and Mediator Queric, let's say, because you're feeling kind of safe and you want to cleanse and then a strong DPS. So then your opponent goes, all right, they picked that. I'm going to pick, let's say, Lionheart Surmia as a character that can help counter Emma Landy. And then the other character would be, let's say, Yolha. So they pick a tank. So then you go, okay, I need to pick characters that are relatively safe against this. I need a character that can deal with Conqueror Lilius still. I need to make sure that Lionheart Surmia doesn't run me over, and I'm a little bit scared of Yolha. What are things that I can actually pick that are safer? So then you decide, okay, Apocalypse Ravi is safe against all of these things, help support my team. And then let's say you pick a tank such as Unbound Knight Airwell. So you're like, okay, my team is now bulky, and I have a character that's able to fight against all 3 of these and help support my team, and I have a good cleanser. And then let's say the opponent decides to pick something such as Briar Witchesaria, which is overall very strong against your team. And then their final unit is, well, they obviously have to pick a DPS of some sort. Let's say Spectre Tenebria. So now the opponent has locked you into a very bad situation because they picked one debuffer right here, and you have a cleanser, but now they have another debuffer as well, and you don't really have ways of actually dealing with that. They have two debuffers. If they ban your cleanser, you're immediately dead. And then they also have a DPS that's able to really easily deal with you, that's hidden, and then they have a DPS slash support right here. The defense breaks you directly in the Lionheart's area. You don't have to know the specifics, but you understand the gist of it, right? Basically, the opponent has outmaneuvered you. The power of first pick as well, where they have first pick priority and they're able to pick stuff, and you kind of have to be more on the defensive. And let's say you pick Payra because it beats this and it beats this. Well, the opponent's going to ban that, and then you have to ban one of these, and you might be in a lot of trouble. But what I'm trying to show is how important it is to be planning ahead, because I didn't do a good draft right here, but if I had planned ahead and thought, okay, well, maybe they picked something like Briar Chesseria, maybe I have to watch out for this stuff, then maybe instead of picking Arable right here, you would have picked Payra right here. And then the opponent wouldn't have been able to pick Briar Chesseria. They would have been like, okay, well, this beats my Conquer Lilius, and it beats my Briar Chesseria, and gives them a tank, essentially. So then the opponent's entire draft has to change right there because you thought ahead and you protected your team. See what I'm saying? It's difficult and it requires a lot of knowledge and time to fully understand, but when you're starting out, you don't need as much of that. You just have to be aware that you should be protecting your characters in that way and how they can actually come together to help each other. So anyways, these were just kind of some of the basic things that I want to talk about for people entering RTA, people trying to understand how it really works, and just some things to consider. I'm also going to be putting out a video talking about a bunch of example drafts because we recently had the World Cup. And I think that the World Cup had some really good professional matches, and you might even see some of these units and teams right there, honestly. And I try to go over them and go into depth of why people are picking specific units to each other and all of that. So anyways, that's about it for this video. I just thought I would kind of lay the groundwork for understanding RTA when you're first trying to get into it, and hopefully that this helped. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments. I'll try to answer what I can. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like or subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you next time.